Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. A clash of perspectives. The Houston airport terminal was alive with movement, families rushing to gates, announcements crackling overhead, and luggage wheels rolling in rhythmic chaos. For Helen Hartley, this day had already tested her patience. A delay, of course. Helen wasn't used to waiting. As a seasoned corporate executive, time was a currency she valued above all else, and right now she was losing it. She sat primly in the corner of gate C-17, her polished black Christian Louboutin heels crossing over each other as she adjusted her position. Her navy Chanel suit, immaculate as always, spoke of her meticulous attention to appearance. Helen glanced down at her Rolex, the glint of its golden band reflecting the overhead light. 40 minutes late now, she muttered under her breath, tapping her perfectly manicured fingers on her leather handbag. She looked up and scanned the crowd with mild disdain. People were too loud, children too messy, and the smell of food trucks too overpowering. Finally, the announcement came. Flight 482 to Boston, now boarding. Helen grabbed her Louis Vuitton carry-on and strode toward the gate. Her first-class ticket allowed her to bypass the haggling travelers, the disheveled families, and her biggest irritation, those military passengers who always seemed to get a hero's welcome. Helen had nothing against the military, or so she told herself. She just couldn't stand the constant glorification. Discounts here, applause there. Surely wearing a uniform didn't warrant such over-the-top hero worship. As she approached her seat in first class -2 air, she settled into the luxurious leather cushion with a soft sigh of relief. First class was her escape. Peace, privacy, and quiet. It was a place where she could finalize her next presentation without interruption. But then she saw him. From the corner of her eye, a young man in a slightly wrinkled military uniform appeared, hoisting a worn green duffel bag over his shoulder. Helen's brows furrowed slightly as she watched him stop by her row. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said softly, his voice polite and even. "I believe I'm in 2B. Helen's eyes narrowed slightly, though she pasted on a strained smile. Another one, she thought, her fingers tightening around the handle of her designer bag. She knew exactly what this was. Another soldier who expected everyone to fawn over him, offer free drinks, or shower him with praise. "You're in first class?" Helen asked flatly, her tone skirting the line between disbelief and annoyance. "Yes, ma'am," the soldier replied, a quiet dignity in his voice. He moved carefully, almost as though his left side was stiff or painful. He set his duffel bag into the overhead compartment with measured movements and then sank into the seat beside her. Helen watched his every motion, the patched uniform, the faint scars across his knuckles, and the tension in his jaw. "First class doesn't usually cater to military discounts," she remarked, a sharp edge to her voice. The soldier turned his head slightly to look at her, his expression calm but guarded. "I paid full fare," he said simply. Helen raised one arched brow. "Oh, really?" Her disbelief hung in the air like a cloud. She'd heard it all before. Soldiers riding the sympathy wave, getting discounts, free upgrades, and endless praise. Her friends called them professional heroes, people who wore a uniform and expected the world to fall at their feet. She didn't say it aloud, but her face betrayed her skepticism. The soldier said nothing. Instead, he pulled a small, slightly worn photograph from his breast pocket and stared at it for a moment, his eyes softening. The tenderness in his expression only irritated Helen further. "What's that?" "A PR photo to show everyone how selfless you are," she quipped, unable to stop herself. The man's fingers tightened around the photograph, but his voice stayed calm. "No, ma'am," he replied without looking at her. "This is my daughter. Her name is Lily." Helen rolled her eyes so hard it felt like a reflex. Of course, playing the family man card now, huh? At that moment, the plane's intercom buzzed to life with safety instructions, cutting through the tension. The soldier carefully tucked the photograph back into his pocket, his movements precise and deliberate. Helen glanced at him again, irritated by how unbothered he seemed by her jabs. She didn't understand people like him, people who could smile quietly while soaking up praise and special treatment. The moment the plane took off, Helen buried herself in her laptop. She had a presentation to finish for tomorrow's meeting in Boston, and she didn't have time to think about some quiet soldier sitting next to her. Yet, her attention drifted. Out of the corner of her eye, Helen noticed the soldier rubbing his shoulder as though it ached. He opened his in-flight magazine, but didn't turn a single page. His eyes were distant and his expression unreadable. Finally, after nearly an hour of silence, Helen couldn't help herself. "You know, you people get a lot handed to you." The soldier blinked and turned toward her, his calm demeanor still intact. "Excuse me." "You know what I mean," Helen continued, waving her hand dismissively. "Discounts, applause, thank yous everywhere you go. You're treated like celebrities. Why? Just because you wear a uniform?" The man didn't speak immediately, as though carefully considering his response. "It's not about being a celebrity," he said softly. Helen scoffed. "Sure it is. Everywhere I go, there's someone thanking a soldier for their service." "What service? What exactly do you do for me?" At this, the soldier's jaw tensed slightly, but he held his tongue. Helen smirked inwardly, satisfied with her point. She expected him to argue, to bark back like most people would. Instead, he pulled the photograph out again, holding it gently. "I'm not asking for anything," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm just a dad trying to get my daughter to Boston. She has leukemia." Helen froze, his words hanging between them like a boulder. She shifted uncomfortably, her arms crossing over her chest as if forming a protective shield. "Oh," she muttered, unable to meet his gaze. "I didn't know that." The soldier tucked the photograph back again. Most people don't. Silence stretched between them for the next hour. Helen couldn't focus on her work anymore. She stared blankly at her laptop screen, the spreadsheet data blurring together. Her earlier smugness seemed hollow now. When the flight attendant rolled the cart down the aisle, she stopped by the soldier's row. "Thank you for your service," she said warmly, offering him a complimentary drink. Helen shot him a pointed look as if to say, "See, special treatment." But the soldier shook his head. "Just water, please," he said, handing over his credit card, "and I'll pay for it." "No need," the attendant replied kindly. "I insist," he said, his voice steady. Helen stared at him in disbelief as he paid for the water. Why would someone turn down something free, she thought. For the first time, she wondered if she'd been wrong about people like him. The truth behind the uniform. The hum of the plane's engines was steady, a monotonous backdrop to the tension lingering between Helen and the soldier. The air around them felt heavy, each minute stretching on like an eternity. Helen stared blankly at her laptop screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, but no words came. Her earlier confidence, no, smugness, had dissipated, leaving a hollow discomfort in its wake. The soldier, Sam, she recalled from the name on his uniform, sat beside her quietly. His posture was straight but not rigid, his hands resting gently on his lap as though carrying an invisible weight. Helen glanced sideways at him, her eyes drawn to the faint scar that curved from the side of his neck, disappearing beneath the collar of his uniform. It wasn't the sort of scar that came from an accident. It was deeper, earned. Against her will, curiosity flickered to life. Helen had always been good at reading people, but Sam Walker was an enigma. His polite demeanor, his refusal to engage in argument, his insistence on paying for his water, it all unsettled her. She glanced down at his duffel bag, now wedged under the seat in front of him. It was well worn. It seemed slightly frayed, as though it had seen more than its fair share of long journeys. One strap bore faint discoloration, a deep red stain that had stubbornly refused to wash out. Helen found herself wondering where that bag had been, what stories it might tell if it could speak. She shook her head, snapping herself out of it. Why do I care? She thought. He's just another soldier. Another person playing the sympathy card. And yet, Helen couldn't deny that something about Sam was different. He wasn't asking for praise. He wasn't basking in hero worship. If anything, he seemed to shy away from it. The flight attendant returned, this time with a tray of meals. Beef or chicken? She asked with a smile. Chicken, please, Sam replied politely. Helen waited as the attendant placed Sam's tray in front of him. When she turned to Helen, her smile wavered slightly, as though recalling Helen's earlier behavior. And for you, ma'am? Chicken, Helen replied curtly, ignoring the faint prick of embarrassment. Sam ate quietly, using precise, deliberate movements. Helen picked at her food, her appetite gone. After several moments of silence, she found herself glancing at him again. He caught her gaze this time, his calm brown eyes meeting hers directly. You keep staring, Sam said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Is there something you'd like to ask me? Helen blinked, caught off guard. No, she replied quickly, but the word felt hollow. She hesitated, pressing her lips together before speaking again. I just don't understand you. Sam set his fork down neatly, tilting his head slightly. What's there to understand? Helen narrowed her eyes, feeling defensive but unable to stop herself. You sit there quietly, refusing free drinks, refusing special treatment. You paid full fare for a first-class seat, and yet you're dressed in that. She gestured at his uniform, like you're trying to make a statement. I'm not trying to make a statement, Sam replied simply. Helen scoffed, leaning back in her seat. Then why wear it? Why not dress in regular clothes and avoid the attention? Sam was silent for a moment, his eyes thoughtful. It's not about attention, he said finally. This uniform isn't for other people. It's for me. Helen frowned, clearly unsatisfied with the answer. What does that even mean? Sam glanced down at his uniform, his hand running absent-mindedly along one of the seams. It's hard to explain to someone who hasn't worn it. But this uniform represents something bigger than me. It represents the people I've served with, the ones who didn't make it home. It reminds me of what I've been through and why I'm still here. Helen felt a flicker of something she couldn't quite name, guilt, maybe, or discomfort. And what exactly have you been through? She pressed, her voice quieter now. Sam's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look angry. He looked tired. More than I care to relive, he replied. The honesty in his voice startled Helen. She expected a rehearsed speech or a defensive retort, but Sam gave her neither. His words were raw, unpolished, and real. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Helen shifted in her seat, suddenly feeling like the intruder in a story she didn't belong to. She glanced at Sam again, watching as he reached for the photograph in his pocket. He held it carefully, his thumb brushing the edges. You said your daughter is sick, Helen said quietly, her tone softer than she intended. What's wrong with her? Sam didn't look up, his eyes fixed on the photograph. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, he replied. She was diagnosed last year. The doctors say there's an experimental treatment in Boston, something that might give her a chance. That's why I'm here. Helen's throat tightened, her earlier irritation replaced by something far more uncomfortable. She opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come. Sam looked at her then, his eyes steady. You asked why I pay for this seat instead of taking a discount. The truth is, I couldn't afford to take a chance on anything less. Lily needs me to be here, to fight for her. She deserves every chance I can give her. Helen swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling into her chest. For the first time, she noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the faint tremor in his hands, and the lines etched into his face that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy burdens. You must love her a lot, Helen murmured. Sam's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. More than anything in this world. Helen looked away, hilt gnawing at the edges of her mind. She thought back to the sarcastic remarks she'd made earlier, the assumptions, the judgments, and felt a pang of shame. Sam wasn't the person she'd imagined him to be. He wasn't here for attention or praise. He was a father fighting for his child, wearing his struggles like invisible armor. The plane jolted slightly as it hit a pocket of turbulence, pulling Helen from her thoughts. She glanced at Sam again, watching as he tucked the photograph back into his pocket and closed his eyes, as though seeking a moment's rest. For the first time in a long while, Helen felt something unfamiliar: regret. She looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her against the backdrop of endless clouds. The woman looking back at her wasn't the confident executive she prided herself on being. She was someone else, someone smaller, pettier, and ashamed. As the flight continued, Helen remained silent, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't quite pin down. For the first time in years, she found herself questioning the assumptions she'd built her life around. Sam Walker, the quiet soldier with the worn photograph, had somehow changed everything. The weight of stories. The hours dragged on, though Helen hardly noticed. The quiet hum of the engines, punctuated by the occasional cough or clatter of trays, seemed a distant backdrop to the thoughts swirling in her head. She kept sneaking glances at Sam, the soldier sitting beside her, who now appeared to be dozing lightly. His breathing was steady, his arms crossed, the faint shadows under his eyes even more pronounced in the soft light of the cabin. Helen had never been one to feel guilt. Regret, perhaps, but never guilt. To her, emotions like that were for weaker people. In her world, dominated by corporate boardrooms and profit margins, there wasn't space for second-guessing yourself. But as she sat next to Sam Walker, she felt guilt settle in her chest like a stone. Her earlier comments replayed in her mind, each word a sharp knife cutting through her pride. Special treatment, playing the sympathy card. The memory of Sam's quiet response, his calm, unshakable dignity, made her cheeks burn. To distract herself, Helen reached for her laptop. She had an important presentation the next day in Boston. The quarterly numbers were strong, and her team was eager to impress a major client. But as she stared at the spreadsheet on her screen, the numbers refused to hold her attention. Her mind kept wandering back to Sam. She let out a quiet sigh and glanced at him again. He hadn't moved. Helen's gaze dropped to his duffel bag. There was something about it, something deeply personal in the way it looked so warm, so used. It wasn't just a bag, it was a piece of him, a piece of his story. She sat back, rubbing her temples. Why did she care so much? Why couldn't she just ignore him and move on? Suddenly, Sam stirred. He blinked a few times before sitting up straighter, stretching his stiff shoulder. Helen watched as he reached into the overhead compartment and pulled out a battered leather journal. He set it in his lap and thumbed through the pages, his expression distant. Curiosity got the better of her. "What's that?" she asked quietly. Sam paused and looked at her, his eyes meeting hers with a trace of surprise. He hesitated before answering. "It's a collection of letters to my daughter." Helen blinked. Letters. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I started writing them when I was deployed overseas. I couldn't always call, so I wrote instead. Letters about my days, about the people I served with, about the things I wanted her to know." He looked down at the journal in his hands. "I wanted her to understand who I am, and why I did what I did." Helen tilted her head, something in her chest tightening. "Does she read them?" Sam shook his head. "Not yet. She's too young. I'm saving them for when she's older, when she's old enough to understand." There was something about his words, simple, unassuming, that hit Helen harder than she expected. She stared at the journal, its worn cover and dog-eared pages, and realized it wasn't just a book of letters. It was a legacy. She hesitated, her voice quieter now. "Why did you start writing them?" Sam exhaled softly, his gaze drifting to the window. "Because I wasn't sure I'd make it back." Helen froze, the weight of his words sinking in. He turned back to her, his eyes calm but serious. "You asked me earlier what I've been through," he said, his voice steady. I didn't want to tell you because most people don't really want to hear it. They think they do, but they don't. Helen held his gaze, feeling something stir inside her. I want to hear it, she said quietly, if you're willing to tell me. Sam studied her for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to trust her. Finally, he nodded. All right. He opened the journal and flipped through a few pages before stopping. His fingers traced one of the handwritten lines, and for a moment he said nothing. When he spoke, his voice was calm but filled with a quiet pain. I was deployed to Afghanistan 4 years ago, he began. Our unit was stationed in a small village, working to rebuild schools and distribute medical supplies. It wasn't the kind of mission people think about when they picture soldiers. We weren't fighting, we were helping. Helen sat still, her focus entirely on him. There was this one day, Sam continued, his voice steady but distant, when we got word that a nearby convoy had been ambushed. We were called to assist. I remember getting into the Humvee, feeling that mix of adrenaline and dread that you never really get used to. We drove out, and that's when we hit it, an IED, improvised explosive device. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Sam's eyes didn't waver. The blast flipped the Humvee. I don't remember the actual explosion, just a deafening sound and then nothing. When I came to, I was lying on the ground, half buried in sand and rubble. My shoulder was dislocated, and there was a piece of shrapnel lodged in my side. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. Helen said nothing, afraid to interrupt him. I could hear my friend, Corporal Davis, shouting for help. He was trapped under the wreckage. I crawled to him, using one arm, and started digging. The fire had already spread, and I knew we didn't have much time. Sam swallowed hard, his voice quieter now. I pulled him out, but I wasn't fast enough. The fire hit one of the fuel tanks, and there was a second explosion. Davis didn't make it. Helen stared at him, her chest tight. Sam looked at his hands, his fingers trembling slightly. I spent weeks recovering in a hospital after that. They gave me a medal, called me a hero, but it didn't feel like that to me. I couldn't stop thinking about Davis, about how I didn't save him in time. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Helen struggled to find her voice. You tried to save him, she said softly. Sam nodded, though his expression remained heavy. I did, but sometimes trying isn't enough. Helen's throat tightened, her earlier judgments crumbling to dust. This wasn't the story of a man basking in glory. It was the story of a man carrying the weight of loss, a weight he wore quietly, without complaint. Is that what the scar is from? She asked hesitantly, gesturing to his neck. Sam nodded. Shrapnel. Helen looked away, guilt flooding her. How wrong she'd been about him, about everything. She'd reduced him to a stereotype, assuming he was like the caricatures in her mind. But he wasn't. He was a man with a story she'd never even tried to understand. The flight attendant appeared again, offering coffee. Sam declined, but Helen asked for a cup, needing something to steady her nerves. As she sipped it, she stole another glance at Sam's journal. Can I ask you something? She said quietly. Sam looked at her. Sure. Why do you write letters to your daughter? Why not just tell her these things? Sam's expression softened, and he smiled faintly. Because some stories are too heavy to share all at once. Sometimes you need to write them down and let the words speak when you can't. Helen stared at him, her heart catching in her chest, cracks in the armor. The airplane cabin felt unnaturally quiet as Sam's story lingered in the air between them. Helen sat frozen, staring blankly at her untouched coffee cup. She felt as though she'd been hit by a wave, one that had pulled her from the shore of her well-manicured life and dragged her into deeper waters she didn't know existed. Her mind replayed everything Sam had said, the IED, the fire, Corporal Davis, the medal he never wanted, the scars he carried, not just the ones on his body, but the invisible ones that lived in his heart and mind. Helen had always thought of soldiers as symbols, not people, faceless figures used in headlines or parades, their stories sanitized and tidy. But Sam was no symbol. Sam was real. For the first time in years, Helen found herself at a loss for words. She didn't know what to say or how to say it. "I'm sorry" felt too small, too hollow, and yet she couldn't just let the moment pass. "Sam," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. I didn't know." Sam looked at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "Most people don't," he replied softly. Helen hesitated. "When I said those things earlier, about soldiers and special treatment, I didn't mean." Sam tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Didn't mean to sound so judgmental." Helen flushed, the heat creeping up her neck. "Yeah," she admitted, looking down at her lap. "It's just, I've never understood it. The attention, the applause, it's always seemed so over the top, like it's undeserved." She flinched even as she said the words, the truth of her thoughts feeling uglier when spoken aloud. But Sam didn't look angry. He didn't even look surprised. Instead, he studied her for a moment, his gaze steady and patient. "I get it," he said finally. "You see the uniform and you make assumptions. Maybe you think we're all the same, like we're just people looking for recognition. But the truth is, most of us don't want it. Most of us didn't sign up to be heroes." Helen frowned, unsure how to respond. "Then why did you sign up?" Sam leaned back in his seat, exhaling softly as though considering the question. "'Cause I wanted to serve. My dad was a firefighter, my mom a nurse. They taught me that life isn't just about what you get, it's about what you give. I joined the military because I believed in something bigger than myself." Helen blinked, taken aback by the simplicity of his answer. "And do you still believe that?" Sam's lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze drifting out the window. "Some days more than others," he admitted. "But when I look at my daughter, when I think about the future I want for her, it reminds me why I did it." Helen stared at him, her mind racing. She thought about the photograph he carried, the way he held it so gently, as though it were made of glass. She thought about the letters in his journal, the quiet way he'd spoken about writing them for his daughter. This man, who she'd so casually dismissed just hours ago, carried burdens she couldn't begin to fathom. "I don't understand how you do it," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the honesty in her voice. "How you carry all of that. The loss, the guilt, the weight of it all." Sam looked at her, his expression softening. "Some days I don't. Some days it's too much. But I keep going because I have to. Because there's no other choice." Helen felt something shift inside her, like a crack in the armor she'd spent years building around herself. She'd always believed strength came from control, from refusing to let the world touch you. But Sam's strength was different. It came from enduring, from carrying the unbearable, and choosing to keep moving forward. The plane jolted slightly as the pilot announced their descent into Boston. Helen barely heard the words. Her thoughts were a blur. She watched as Sam tucked the journal back into his bag, moving carefully as though every motion cost him effort. As the cabin lights flickered brighter, Helen glanced down at her phone and saw a notification from her assistant. It was a reminder about her presentation the next day, her big moment, the one she'd been preparing for all week. She was supposed to be focused, sharp, ready to impress the clients who'd flown in from across the country. But she didn't feel sharp or focused. For the first time in years, Helen felt like she was seeing the world differently, like she was seeing herself differently. The landing was smooth, and soon the seatbelt light chimed off. Passengers began standing, pulling bags from overhead compartments and chatting about their plans. Sam moved carefully, reaching for his duffel bag with a quiet grimace of pain. Helen noticed the way he favored his left side, the injury he hadn't complained about once during the flight. She watched him for a moment before finally speaking. Can I help you with that?" Sam paused, glancing at her in surprise. "No need, ma'am. I've got it." Helen frowned. "It's Helen. My name is Helen." Sam nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "All right, Helen." The two of them stepped off the plane together, and as they walked through the bustling terminal, Helen found herself feeling nervous, a strange, unfamiliar sensation. She wanted to say something, to fix the impression she'd left earlier, but she didn't know how. Finally, as they reached the exit, she stopped and turned to him. "Sam." He turned to look at her, the wariness in his face softened by kindness. "Yeah." Helen hesitated, searching for the right words. "Thank you," she said softly, the words tasting unfamiliar on her tongue. "Not just for what you did out there, for what you do every day. For your daughter, for everything." Sam studied her for a moment, as though seeing her for the first time. He nodded, his expression sincere. "You're welcome." Helen watched as he turned and disappeared into the crowd, his worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. She stood frozen for a moment, her chest tight. She thought about Lily, waiting for her father at the hospital. She thought about Sam, carrying his burdens with quiet dignity. And she thought about herself, about the life she'd built, the priorities she'd chosen, and the assumptions she'd made about people like him. For the first time in a long while, Helen wondered if she'd been living her life all wrong. As she walked toward the baggage claim, her phone buzzed with another notification, her assistant again, asking about final notes for the presentation. Helen sighed, looking at the message but unable to focus on it. "Maybe some things matter more," she murmured under her breath. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she walked away, feeling, for the first time in years, like she might be ready to change. Redemption and reflection. The morning light streamed through the window of Helen's hotel suite in Boston, slicing across the room in golden slants. The city bustled outside, honking horns, distant chatter, and the hum of life moving on as it always did. Helen sat at the edge of her bed, her laptop open in front of her. The presentation she had spent weeks perfecting was ready, flawless, professional, exactly as it needed to be. But she couldn't stop thinking about Sam Walker. The memory of the flight haunted her, replaying in vivid clarity, the quiet strength in his voice, the way he carried his burdens without complaint, and that worn photograph of his daughter Lily. Helen hadn't slept much. The face of that soldier, along with the unspoken weight of his pain, tugged at her thoughts like an anchor. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from her assistant lit up the screen. "Everything's set for 10 a.m. Conference room B. Clients are eager. You've got this." Helen stared at the message for a long moment before setting the phone down. "You've got this." The phrase rang hollow in her ears. For so long, Helen had measured success by these moments, landing deals, impressing clients, climbing higher and higher up a ladder that never seemed to end. But now, something felt different. Who was she doing this for? With a groan, she pushed herself to her feet and walked to the window, staring out at the city's skyline. She thought about Sam again, about his story and his quiet resolve. He had done so much for so little recognition, she thought. And what have I done? Suddenly, she remembered something. Boston Children's Hospital. Sam had mentioned it. He was taking Lily there for treatment. Helen didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming urge to do something, anything to help. She grabbed her phone, did a quick search, and found the hospital's address. It wasn't far. A choice that matters. 2 hours later, Helen found herself standing awkwardly in the waiting area of Boston Children's Hospital. The space was bright and cheerful, colorful walls painted with murals of cartoon animals, soft music playing in the background, and the low hum of nurses and families moving through the halls. Despite the warm atmosphere, Helen felt entirely out of place. What was she even doing here? She glanced around, clutching her handbag nervously. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. Her assistant was probably pulling her hair out back at the conference room. But for the first time in her life, Helen didn't care. The presentation, the clients, the bottom line, it all seemed so insignificant now. Her thoughts were interrupted when she saw him. Sam Walker stood at the far end of the waiting room, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he talked quietly to a nurse. Even from a distance, Helen could see the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion etched into his face. Beside him was a little girl, holding onto his hand. Helen's breath caught in her throat. Lily. The child looked small and frail, her head wrapped in a bright pink scarf that matched her oversized hoodie. She clung to a stuffed animal, a battered teddy bear that had clearly seen better days. Despite her fragile appearance, her face lit up as she looked up at Sam, chattering softly. Helen took a deep breath and approached. Sam turned, sensing someone nearby, and his eyes widened in surprise when he saw her. "Helen," he said, clearly stunned. "What are you doing here?" Helen hesitated, her confidence faltering under his questioning gaze. "I just wanted to check in," she said, her voice softer than usual. "You mentioned the hospital. I thought maybe there was something I could do." Sam blinked, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to come all this way." "I know," Helen replied quickly, "but I wanted to." Lily peered up at Helen with wide, curious eyes. "Who's that, Daddy?" Sam glanced down at her, his expression softening. "This is Miss Helen. She was on the plane with me." Lily smiled shyly. "Hi, Miss Helen." Helen's heart clenched. "Hi, Lily," she said, crouching down slightly so she was at eye level with the girl. "I like your teddy bear." Lily hugged the bear tightly. "This is Mr. Wiggles. He's my brave bear." Helen felt a lump in her throat. "He must be very brave then." "He is," Lily replied earnestly. "Daddy says he keeps me strong." Helen looked up at Sam, her chest tightening. "You have a very brave little girl." Sam's lips twitched into a faint smile. "She gets it from her mom." Helen hesitated before standing. "Sam, I know it's not my place, but I want to help, however I can." Sam frowned slightly. "Helen, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she interrupted gently, "but I want to." Sam studied her for a long moment, as if trying to understand her sudden change of heart. Finally, he nodded. "Okay." Helen reached into her bag and pulled out a small card. "This is my personal number," she said, handing it to him. "If there's anything you need, anything at all, just call me. And please," she paused, her voice wavering slightly, "let me help with Lily's treatment, financially." Sam stared at her, his expression unreadable. "Helen, you don't have to do that." "I know," she replied, her voice firm, "but I want to. And not because I feel sorry for you, because I don't. I respect you, Sam, more than you know." For the first time, Sam looked genuinely taken aback. He glanced down at Lily, who was now happily humming to herself as she hugged Mr. Wiggles. When he looked back at Helen, his eyes were softer. "Thank you," he said quietly. Helen smiled faintly, feeling something shift inside her. For so long, she had lived her life in pursuit of success, status, and control. But standing here, in this hospital, beside a man who had given so much without asking for anything in return, Helen realized something important. Success wasn't about what you gained, it was about what you gave back. A new beginning. Later that afternoon, Helen finally arrived at the conference room where her assistant was waiting, clearly frazzled. "Where have you been?" The client's hour. "It's fine," Helen interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let's get started." The presentation went well. Helen hit every talking point, every number, every objective. But her voice carried a new softness, an authenticity that her team had never heard before. She wrapped up the meeting with a calm confidence, shaking hands with the clients before excusing herself. As she walked out of the building, she pulled out her phone. A notification popped up, an email from the hospital confirming her donation to Lily Walker's treatment fund. Helen smiled softly, a sense of peace settling over her. She thought of Sam, of his quiet strength, and of Lily's shy smile. For the first time in years, Helen felt like she'd done something meaningful, something that mattered. She slipped her phone back into her bag and walked down the busy Boston street, her heels clicking against the pavement. The world around her felt the same, but she wasn't the same. Not anymore. Because sometimes it only takes one moment, one chance meeting of a stranger, to change everything. And for Helen Hartley, that moment had come at 30,000 feet.